Our guest today is
all my friends
a
love
soul
you.
brother of mine. He's younger, obviously, but we grew up together in the American Italian Historical Association, and I succeeded Gary as the newsletter editor of the association. And Gary, though, was kidnapped somewhere along the way and made to study Florida and only Florida. And today he is the historian of Florida. And he is a prolific writer. He's written a short book that I like a lot about the Italians in Florida. He's written a long book about all of Florida, A Land of Sunshine and Dreams. I can't remember the title, but it had Sunshine and Dreams in it. And he can tell you. And he's a Duckworth professor. You have to explain what a Duckworth professor is. Endowed professor of history at University of South Florida. So I'll let him take over. Gary, tell us a little bit about your career and your early writings.
Buonasera, buonasera. My name is Gary Mormino, Gary Ross Mormino. My father was Rossellino, a very Sicilian name. The Morminos came from Alia in Sicily. Anyone been to Alia? It's 2 towns over from Corleone and Licata Fritti, where Frank Sinatra and Lucky Luciano came from. It's, I think, about 60 miles south of Palermo. And the family, the village of Alia, many of the males were brokered, and they went to Napoleonville, Louisiana to cut sugarcane. A hard way to begin your life in America. And I remember in 1980, I was a Fulbright scholar in Italy. And I had the fortune, incredible fortune, to live with my Sicilian family, who after World War II moved from Alia to a very impoverished village outside Rome. And my great uncle was there, the brother of my grandfather who had been dead 20 years. And he didn't speak any English. And one day we're talking, and he told me, he said, you know, I do speak English. And I said, really? Serio? And he said, you're a son of a bitch. About 6 or 7 vulgar expressions his brothers had taught him were phrases that he would need in America. But the last expression was, hey, mister, you got the job for me. The expression you really need. But the family then had moved from Napoleonville, Louisiana, in sugarcane country, to Wood River, Illinois. Any of you ever been to Wood River, Illinois? It's not a pretty place. It's across the river from St. Louis. It's near East St. Louis, and it has 6 oil refineries and circled by 2 steel mills. And you all would appreciate this is a good place to go if you're an unskilled immigrant. And my grandfather, Rossellino, worked for the Standard Oil Refinery, told the story that one day, every day, he said he put a brick, he was a bricklayer there. He was a muratore in the old country, stonemason, but bricklayer in America. And every day he took a brick home in his lunch pail. And one day the boss came and said, I want to inspect your lunch pail. And he looked in and he said, why are you stealing bricks from Mr. Rockefeller? And he replied, I want to show my sons what I do for a living. I'm proud of my work. And he was allowed a pass. And the family legend is that 20 years later, he had enough bricks to build a home. Now, the fact that the home was built of wood is immaterial. It's the legacy that's important. I wish I could then say I was incredibly close to my Sicilian grandparents. By the way, I had a step Sicilian grandfather, Stasi. from Casa Italia in Italy. And my grandparents spoke very little English. There were like 30 cousins, 40 cousins around. And it's one of the greatest regrets of my life. I never had a chance to sit down with them. And so everything I know has been through family. I found out more in Italy and Sicily than I did in America. So I went to school, went to Millikan University in Decatur, Illinois, and almost went on in psychology, but I decided to go on history. But I didn't know what kind of history, except I was real interested in the working class. And at the University of North Carolina, the phone is ringing. At UNC, I had a very good professor, and he said, you should think about doing Italian immigration. And so about 1970, I'm guessing, I'm home, and I went over to the Hill in St. Louis. How many of you have been to the Hill in St. Louis? La Montagna, as they called it. I still think it's the most interesting Italian neighborhood I've ever been to, and it's still pretty much an Italian neighborhood. So I went there very early in the morning. It's 20 miles from my hometown, but I had never been there, which is how provincial my life was. And I think I'm on the Hill, and I see this big guy walking around in the morning. And I roll down my window, and I said, "Excuse me, is this Dago Hill?" Everyone in my neighborhood called it Dago Hill. And he comes and he grabs me by my shirt collar and said, "Son, you better be Italian." So I passed the test. And really, in some ways, it was a terrible dissertation topic. I had a year lease, I think, on an apartment in 1973. So I went there, and the first week there, I went to all the libraries and historical societies in St. Louis. They had nothing on the Hill, nothing. And I'm thinking, I picked the wrong neighborhood. I don't know what I'm going to do for the next months. And out of desperation, I bought a tape recorder. And I started going around and interviewing anyone who looked 60 years old and older. And it turned out to be the greatest research break in my life. Immigrants don't leave behind letters and archives, but they have great memories. And even then, people were saying, "Oh, you should have been here 5 years ago." But I don't know how you would do a history of the Hill today. Interviewing the people there would be a second or third generation story. And at the time, I was teaching at the University of South Florida in Tampa. But book on the Hill to get tenure. And then a colleague from the University of North Carolina was teaching at the University of Florida. His name was George Pazzetta. His family was from the Piedmont. When he met my Sicilian relatives, when George told them he was from the Piedmont, they said, "Oh, so you're really French. You're not Italian, right?" It was crushed, absolutely crushed. Anyway, George had already begun doing a history of Ybor City, Ybor City. I know Dominic has been there, but I'm guessing many of you have not. It's the second greatest break in my academic career. Ybor City is absolutely fascinating. It was the unhill. The hill was it had nothing but Italians, although there were northern and southern Italians who hated one another. The northern Italians were from Lombardy. It was a very conservative community. Everyone seemingly wanted their son to be a priest and their daughter to be a nun. I should add, I have a sister who is a Poor Clare in St. Louis. But the Ybor City, on the other hand, was very radical on the left. They hated the Catholic Church. Most people were not even married by a priest in Ybor City. They were married by a justice of peace. The neighborhood kind of was destroyed in the 1960s, classic urban America. And by the way, there's a great book on that topic, and you know it as so well in Chicago because of the Circle, that an interstate highway sliced through it, and then urban renewal destroyed it. But architecturally, the Ybor City is still a pretty fascinating place. The one great distinction of Ybor City compared to the rest of urban Italian America is the significance of the Mutual Aid Society. Most places I've studied, the Mutual Aid, we were talking earlier about someone needs to do something about Italian immigrants and the great flu epidemic of 1918. And I was suggesting, I bet it was the death knell of many of the small Italian mutual aid societies. There were so many deaths at one time, and they simply couldn't have coped with the life insurance losses. On the other hand, in Tampa, first of all, you had 4 distinct immigrant groups living in one huge neighborhood. Sicilians from Santo Stefano di Quisquina in southwestern Sicily. You had a very large Spanish community from Galicia and Asturias in northwestern Spain. And the biggest group was Cubans, but you had black Cubans and, quote, white Cubans living there. So you had 4 groups. So it's fascinating ethnic dynamic. And ultimately, they really bonded, I think, because most of Tampa hated the immigrants there so much, they figured the only way we can survive is bonding. And an interesting term came about. They called themselves Latins, not Latinos in the current sense, but Latins. A Latin was someone who was Hispanic and Sicilian, and black, by the way, as well. I should add, the Sicilians got along quite well with Africa, with the Afro-Cubans there. Ybor City was a very radical community. They worked in the cigar factories. Tampa was the cigar capital of America. And these were pretty good jobs. I figured out in 1910 that a tabaquero, a cigar maker made as much in Tampa in 1910 as a union carpenter made in Chicago. And the cost of living was much less. So those are the two great breaks in my life was growing up near St. Louis and choosing the Hill as a topic, and then going to Tampa, Florida. Sadly, by the 1980s, happily for me, I thought my career prospects were better studying Florida. And you don't have to give up studying immigrants in Florida. Florida is one of the great immigrant states now. But one of the fascinating aspects is you've got maybe hundreds of thousands, at least tens of thousands of retired Italians in places like Naples, Marco Island, the villages. So that's a fascinating phenomenon, what happens to retired Italians when they retire to Florida? And, you know, with the groceries and the
everybody goes right,
etc. So that's a long introduction. I'd happily take questions, or if you have any. I should also add, I'm working on a large book, World War II, and I think the great book that needs to be done is Italian Americans in World War II. I think you could argue the 2 great events in Italian American life was the coming of the Italian immigrants, 1890, 1915 or so. But the second event was World War II. I don't think anything intensified the feelings of being an outsider in a new world. It's very interesting. When I was researching at the Franklin Roosevelt Library, I'd be happy to share this poll with you, but the archivist came and gave me a Gallup poll, and the headline was "Not to be published" for very obvious reasons. And they asked Americans in 1942, how do you trust the other people in the world compared to your own people? And at the top, as you might imagine, were Norwegians, Swedes, Danes, British. Interestingly, the Irish ranked very high. 100 years earlier, the Irish would have been at the bottom. And then you had Germans, believe it or not, Jewish refugees, and Italians and Japanese were at the bottom of the poll. But I think, along with Jews, I interviewed a lot of people about this. I think World War II was such an intense experience that on the eve of the war, I think if you had asked many Italian Americans, they would have said, we don't really feel like we belong, that we're outsiders looking in. And I think by the end of the war, they felt, we really are all in this together. I think it was a great bonding experience. Others disagree, I think, but questions, please.
Yeah, Gary, I have an article that's in that anthology that was put out recently on Italian Americans in World War II. And I think I must have stolen your idea that it was one of the two most important things that influenced Italian American history, the original migration and then the experience in World War II. And so thanks for letting me steal that idea. Yeah, I've got a lot of stuff that I did in terms of Chicago newspapers and World War II Italians.
I think I sent you a lot of stuff too, didn't I? From George Pezzetta's.
Yeah, for those of you of the volunteers who do the archiving, this is the Gary Mormino that sends us that stuff that you never know what to do with. And whether to put it under, we've decided to just put it under Gary's name, and the various topics, which are very various, can take care of themselves. Although there should be in our database more than one tag.
I always thought it was a shame that Dominic and I never lived in the same town. We would have been a heck of a team.
I've always felt very comfortable
Yes.
with Gary, as if we have been together all these years, but it's we haven't lived in the same town. And then Gary, you became a Floridian, the top Florida expert. Tell us a little bit about that.
Florida is a fascinating state. In many ways, it resembles Italy, if you think about it. The shape of the two peninsulas. Napoleon once said of Italy, Italy is too long to be a nation. And in many ways, Florida is too long to be a state. It should have been 3 states, probably. But for most of American history, Florida was just too isolated, too hot, too poor, too humid to consider moving to. But after World War II, you think the great breakthroughs, you had DDT, that you could now live year-round in places like Sanibel and Marco Island and not be eaten alive by mosquitoes. You had the GI Bill, but you also had air conditioning, the importance of air conditioning to Florida. Florida is now, think of this, on the eve of World War II, we keep coming back to World War II. In 1940, Florida had 1.9 million inhabitants. It was the smallest state in the American South. Arkansas and South Carolina had more residents than Florida. In some ways, World War II is the linchpin connecting this impoverished Florida to a modern Sunbelt state today. Today, Florida has 21 million residents. It's the 3rd largest state in the nation. It long ago passed Illinois. And I'd love to know the stats. I bet there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Illinoisians in Florida. I run into them all the time, mainly from the Chicago area. But Florida Florida also once solidly Democratic. I once found the registration records, voting registration records in 1940, and I think I counted 15 counties that did not have a single registered Republican. That's how solidly, and today Florida leans very heavily Republican. I believe both U.S. senators. I'm not sure there's a single high-ranking Democrat in Florida today. The governor is the first Italian-American governor of Florida, Ron D-E capital S-A-N-T-I-S, kind of a Latinized Italian. But he was a congressman, and Donald Trump plucked him out of obscurity. He was an obscure congressman from kind of the Ormond Beach area, I think, and now he's the governor of Florida. Not doing well with the coronavirus. Florida is kind of everything. It's kind of every man's state. There's probably about a dozen states within the state. It's the oldest state in America in terms of median age. I think the median age of Florida is now 42. Think about that. Think of what the median age of Italian immigrants would have been in 1940. I'm guessing it would have been 18 or lower maybe. I mean, big families, but average age is 42. There are more deaths than births. I live in St. Petersburg, which was a favorite destination for people from Chicago, as I recall. I'm trying to find this old note card I had, but one of the Chicago teachers unions bought property. They bought an apartment complex in St. Petersburg, where when they would retire, they could move to St. Petersburg. Unions did the same thing. So that's a fascinating aspect of old age in Florida. How many of you have heard of the Villages? Is capital V, the Villages, which is in Central Florida. If you're running for national or state office, as a Republican, the first stop you make is the Villages. It's over 100,000 people. It sprawls over 3 counties, and I don't even think it's an incorporated community, but it's a very conservative community. But on the other hand, on the East Coast, Boca Raton, Palm Beach, not so much Palm Beach, you have Democratic old age homes. Lots of Jews and Italians from the Northeast retire there. So it's, for years in Naples, there was a reunion of Cleveland Italian Americans. What I found, and this is not shocking, that people act very much like they did when they were immigrants. They tend to be chain migrants. So your paisani who retired in Naples really loves it from Cleveland, so you moved down there. And so Sons of Italy chapters have flourished in those areas. So that's a thumbnail sketch leaning on the Italian side. Other questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Please, Senor.
Talk about Tuscany.
What about Tuscany? As in
Florida. I'm
unaware of many. Now you mention it, you've embarrassed me. I'm trying to think if I know a single person. I should add, I taught on 4 separate occasions in Florence. Florida State University has a study abroad program in Florence.
Right, I know. And
it's one of my favorite places but I don't know, you probably know more about this than I do, please.
No, I'm asking, I don't know. I mean,
is your family from?
Yeah, my family is Toscano and I speak Italian.
And of course, one of Dominic's and I mean, if there is a Holy Father, probably the wrong metaphor for Rudy Veccoli. If there's a patriarch in Italian American studies, it's Rudy Veccoli.
Yeah. He came to our house once.
Vecoli was from,
Vecoli was from,
it's outside Florence. It's
the town that I'm from is called Barga. Vecoli came to our house too, but I can't remember.
What's the birthplace of
Luca?
No, who composed La Boheme, the great Italian conductor opera? That's the town he is from. It's a great food place. Someone Google up
Google Vecoli.
Yeah.
Vecoli.
Are you trying to think
by
of
the
Luke?
way, a rooted memory. I think it's the last Italian-American event I attended, the Historical Society, and Rudy gave a paper. Here's someone whose entire career was boosting Italian immigrants, studying Italian immigrants.
Oh yeah, he was the first.
But his last talk was, when did Italians become white folks?
Right.
He was saying, I mean, he was a prophet that, I mean, think about what's happening in California today. There's a new bill, it passed, that every California student is going to have to study Hispanic history and African American history. And there have been protests saying, what about Italians and Irish? And we're out of the picture now. I mean, we're white folks now, according to many of the immigrant groups. I'm going to think of the name. I've been to the composer's house.
You mean Puccini?
Yeah.
Puccini. Puccini was from Forte dei Marmi, I think.
No, it was from Luca.
No, Luca.
It's from Luca.
It's from Luca.
Luca is what I was
Luca.
thinking of. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Luca, right.
Grazie. Let's sing a ballad from La Boheme.
Picelli da Manine. Dr. Mormino, this is Carla Simonini. Ciao. I can say my father is down there in Naples and he's Tuscan. Our family's also from Barga, which was a nice coincidence when I met Gloria here. But
Right.
the rest of the family is from other parts of Italy, but it's interesting because they have really fit in down there and they've made a great friendship group. And I think it's not a coincidence. A lot of them happen to be other Italian Americans that have settled in the area. So I find that it's an interesting idea of what this later migration of the Italian Americans. But I was interested in your second study when you talked about the area around Tampa, because I remember reading one of my colleagues looks at lynching laws and how the Italian government got involved in after the 1892 lynchings in New Orleans. And I know there was another well-publicized one that took place in Tampa, I'm pretty sure.
Yes.
That's something that figures in with your research of that area as well. So
Yes, and I've had a very uncomfortable experience lately with that. So in 1910.
Yeah. Oh, 1910, was that late?
In 1909, the Anglos, as they were called in Tampa, really detested the immigrant. There was a love-hate relationship. Tampa was built on cigars and the taxes.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
But they hated the immigrants. They hated their customs. They tended to be anti-clerical. So they would be playing ball and having pig roast on Sundays. And in 1909, the Tampa Tribune, the newspaper, actually editorialized that Tampa would be better off if Italians would be on the gallows. I mean, really. And then the following year, what happened, there was a strike. The immigrant laborers, the tabaqueros, were very militant and very radical. And there was I think a 9-month strike, if you can imagine that. And 2 Italians were arrested for killing a bookkeeper during the strike. I used to remember their name. Their names are not important. The Italian immigrants were charged with murder, and then they were being, quote, transferred to another jail. And this was obviously a setup, a vigilante setup. And they stopped, released the 2 prisoners to the crowd and they hanged them. And not only did they hang them, they put pipes in their mouths and took photographs, and the next day they were selling postcards. The governor was so appalled that he forbade the selling of postcards, not because he was offended, because it was bad for tourism. It's the greatest mass lynching in Tampa history. So, some of you may know about there's a national association that is documenting lynchings in America. And Tampa, it's as I mentioned, the greatest mass lynching in Italian. The commission in Tampa will not recognize that lynching. They claim the lynching was done by their own people, which is insane. But I think we know the real reason is that, you know, it's racial politics is very polarized, to say the least. So the lynchings of 1910 is not being documented in Tampa. Stefano Luconi, is that his name, Dominic?
Yes,
Yes.
Luconi, sì.
Did a really good article on this. I should see if I could send it to you. It's the best research from the Italian side. And you're right, the Italian government was very concerned about this because of the New Orleans. In fact, there's something like 80 or 90 Italians were lynched in the Deep South.
Yeah, I remember.
Often seen as more black than white. There's a book for someone to do on that topic.
Well, there's been a couple of books published on that. One of my colleagues talked about the lynching of the Italians. I mean, it's such a missed opportunity that it should get
Yes.
politicized like that, because there's so much talk right now. I'm being in Chicago, especially about Ida Wells and her campaign against
Yes.
lynching of the African Americans. And then, I mean, no one disputes that the vast majority of people who were lynched, you know, were African Americans, but there were other groups that were subject to this. And I don't think,
Yes.
you know, being exclusionary, you know, is helpful. I mean, the Italian involvement actually pushed through legislation that went a lot farther than Ida Wells was able to do. And there's a story in that as well. So
Yes.
what group in
There's
particular?
There's a film called I Linciati.
I Linciati, yeah,
Done
right.
by a
There's a
woman
book-
whose name I can't remember.
Well, the book is Soap and a Rope or something, which it was published first in Italian, then it was translated into English. And then there's a colleague of mine who just had her work. Her name is Patrizia Stahl. That's her maiden name. And she did a very intricate look at all the legislation that happened during that period, the Italian government, what it pushed for and everything. So, well, what's
Interesting.
Ma si dice linciare in italiano?
Yes.
Linciare?
Sì, linciato, linciare, linciati, sì.
Linciare, sì.
Yeah.
I thought one of the biggest lynchings in the United States was in Louisiana that
Yeah.
caused riots in the
Yes.
streets for
Right.
days.
1892, there over the killing of the police chief named Hennessy, an Irishman.
Yes.
And was it 12 Italians, 11 Italians?
11.
11.
I think it's the greatest mass lynching in American history.
Well,
Yeah.
the largest recorded one, which we always have to be careful to say that. No one knows others that might have happened. But on record, yes, the largest single mass lynching on record, for
Now,
sure.
I was watching a film on the history of the Chinese in America. And
They were
they
lynched too.
spoke of an incident where over 25 of them perished. So,
Where, Domenico?
huh? Where?
Yeah.
This is on
West Coast?
On the
public
West Coast.
television. It was on the
California.
West Coast. I don't
California.
That's
know.
why they talk about what was recorded, because there's factual documentation. There's no dispute that took place at that time. But yeah, the Chinese were subject to lynching too. There's, it was a form of
Tampa-
social control.
By the way, Tampa has a fascinating Chinese community that came from Cuba. That is fascinating that you don't think of Chinese. In fact, if you remember the infamous scene in Godfather 2, where they went to the strip club, that was supposedly Little Shanghai, the largest Chinese community in the Caribbean. And when slavery ended in Cuba, a lot of Chinese were imported, and they kind of dominated the laundry industry in Tampa. And if you go to some Cuban restaurants today, they still have on the menu chop suey, which and fried rice and things like that, which weird. But so America is a very rich place in terms of experiences and the cross fertilizations there.
Gary, tell us about when they made your book into a movie. You're the only historian that I know who's had a book made into a movie.
I'm trying to think. Book into a movie. I think
the documentary, the history of Florida.
Yes, yeah, they're a film, not a movie. The film, my book was called Land of Sunshine, State of Dreams. It's a history of Florida from 1945 to about 2000. And the idea of the Florida dream is if you take the American dream that is so dear to immigrants, and Florida, the notion that I tried to project was Florida is a dream state. Only California and Florida, I think, are authentic dream states. To be a dream state, you need to have lots of shoreline, you need to have palm trees swaying. But most importantly, you need to have the promise of a better life, or at least a better February. And that idea really took hold after World War II. When think about this, I always use the example. I'll put Chicago as an example. So imagine you're living in downstate Illinois, and you're at a Lutheran church volunteering in 1940, and your family's been there for 5 generations, and you fully expect to spend the rest of your life there. After all, you're volunteering for the church to take care of the seniors, and someday the young people will be taking care of you. But what happened after World War II was millions and millions of senior citizens moved to California and Florida, where they had no roots at all. I mean, it's as dramatic as the Great Migration. So that's what was part of it, and it was made into a PBS documentary, and it won an Emmy. Actually, it won an Emmy as a documentary. I think if you go online, Mormino. And the name of the documentary is The Florida Dream. It's not named after the Florida Dream. Ed Asner, by the way, narrated it. Burt Reynolds was going to narrate it and wanted too much money for PBS. But that was a very interesting experience. I had a good friend who was a filmmaker. My son-in-law now is a filmmaker, by the way, a documentarian. So thanks for bringing that up. Yes, when you said movie, you had me nervous. There was interestingly, I thought you were referring to Len. What's the name of the great Florida novelist who writes about crime? I'll think of it later. But anyway, he did a book on the mafia in Tampa. And he was I mean, this guy is really big time. I mean, in terms of his books being made in a movie. And I was kind of disappointed because he lived not far away, but he never came and talked to me because I did interview a few crime figures. And so when Lynn asked him to autograph the book, he signed it to Tommaso, who's the name of the principal mobster in the book. So he had read the book. So I've kind of helped make a movie, I guess. Zora, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the immigrant Italian experience.
Gary, could you speak of Italians who, my Nono's family, for example, had immigrated to Argentina, and then from Argentina to the United States. Could you speak of how that experience may have been different for Italians who came directly from Italy to the United States?
Yeah, I could tell you how I would have known a lot more about this. So in 1990, I had another Fulbright, and I was scheduled to go to Buenos Aires. I was going to study Italian immigrants in Argentina. I was going to take my 2 young daughters I thought it would be great if they learned Spanish. And it became so hot politically with the crime and everything, at the last minute, they advised this probably wouldn't be a good idea. Now, we went to Florence instead, so I'm not asking for sympathy. But there's a great book that was done about 1919 by Robert Forrester on Italian immigrants that has a tremendous amount on the Argentine experience. Prior to about 1890, 1895, there were more Italian immigrants in Argentina than America.
Yeah, right. I know that.
And it suddenly changed dramatically, but you look no further than Pope Francis, the Italian experience in Argentina. I mean, who would have guessed the first Italian American, literally, Pope would be an Argentinian. Dom was his name, Sam Bailey from Rutgers. He also studied. He was quite a student of Italian immigration. Sam Bailey, I'm almost sure is his name. B-A-Y, did several books on Italians in Argentina. I don't consider myself an authority on the subject, but it's huge. As important as probably Spaniards in Argentina. And interestingly, very similar to Ybor City with Cubans, Spaniards, and Italians there.
Some years ago, my husband and I went to Buenos Aires, where we stayed for 2 weeks, and we took a little course with a woman for a week, and they had a whole list of Italian words that they used that I didn't even know. I mean, they were words from God knows what dialect they were from, but they thought that they were Italian. And it was interesting to see the difference between the two. It was also interesting to be able to speak Italian to these Argentinians who then spoke Spanish to us, and we communicated easily because it was very Italian sounding. All Spanish isn't, but theirs was.
How interesting.
So that was fun.
There's a great, that would make a great article for someone, these words that sound Italian. For instance, when I was interviewing immigrants in Tampa, I would always ask them about their educational experiences. And for the second or third time, I heard the word friscola.
What is the word?
And I look at my dictionary and I can't find it. And someone, it means free school, and that public school, as opposed to religious school. And of course, Baccahausa was another. Grosseria, I think, is another. So you brought back pleasant memories when you asked that question.
There was a sign in New York that said "Non spoglia la grassa." It was sitting on the grass. Don't spoil my grass. Don't dress the fat lady, eh? We had a Casa di Bricchi here in Rhode Island. Casa di Bricchi.
You know, it's St. Louis, you mentioned brick. In St. Louis, the immigrants there, many of them, including Joe Garagio's father and Yogi Berra's father, they were both Northern Italian, but they worked in a brick factory. St. Louis, the clay in St. Louis was very good for making sewer pipe and fire brick and things such as that. So.
Wasn't Rosa's husband a brick?
Yes, she came to St. Louis briefly. Rosa Casateri, was it?
Yeah.
Oh, La Famosa.
That's one of the great books of all time, by the way, with Rosa.
What I learned in America is not to be afraid.
She was...
Not to be what, Dom?
Afraid.
Rosa lived in a area in Missouri that made, they were lead miners. But I believe she came to the Hill very briefly.
Wasn't she Milanese, or wasn't that where she was from?
Yes. No, she was from Cugiano. She was
what is that?
Cugianese, where all the immigrants, most of the immigrants on the Hill are from, it's from Lombardia. But
Lombardia, yeah.
Cuggiono, Cuggiono.
Mhm.
Time there. It's on an old canal from like the 16th century.
Mhm.
And Rosa also worked at a filanda. How many of you know the word filanda? F-I-L-A-N-D-A. A silk, S-I-L-K, a silk mill. And that was their kind of garment trade. They worked to make silk from silkworms.
Finlandia?
Filanda, F-I-L-A-N-D-A. F-I-L-A-N-D-A.
O che filavano.
No, as in Florida.
Spinning. It's like spinning. A spinning.
Oh,
Oh, yeah, fila. The
Like
fila
a
is
fila, like a thread, yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
she was a little girl.
Yeah.
Because
She was
little girls could handle the
They had the nimble
Yes.
fingers.
Nimble finger, yes.
better than adults.
And the same in the southern cotton mills.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I teach that book in class, and we talk about, what it was like that actually had more, she had more agency in Italy than she did when she came over as the bride.
Yes,
in the United
very
States.
true.
Yeah.
Treated very badly in the mining towns. On that subject of great immigrant novels, I was teaching a class. The other, I keep changing fields, but I'm also working on a book on the history of food in America and Florida. And I teach a class now on food and history. And I use a novel. How many of you have read Rolvaag, R-O-L-V-A-A-G, Giants in the Earth?
Yeah, I read that.
Yeah, I love that. But it's
The classic of immigrant literature, yes.
he's Norwegian. And last year, I had this one passage. To me, it's the greatest passage in immigrant literature. Per Hansa has homesteaded land in America, and he's getting ready for his first harvest. And he's saying, I'm giddy today. He's oiling the scythe. And he said, only in America would they give a Norwegian 160 acres of land, and I'm going to grow wheat, not rye, but wheat, the king of grains. So I asked the students in the class, someone has to read this passage with a Scandinavian background. And this is in Pure America. A kid from Sudan, a black kid from Sudan, read it with an accent out of Fargo. I mean, it was just.
Okay. Well,
Thank you for bringing up Rosa.
Okay. Let's go around
tomorrow?
the Zoom and ask each person to make a comment or question on today's activities. We have.
We get one in there.
I would like to say something.
Yes, great, Gary.
Yes.
Gary, do you know of the Perro family in Del Rey? Pretty important with groceries there.
I do not. It's a beautiful. It's
All
beautiful.
right. Well, I traced that my great uncle started the green pepper and red pepper business and then turned it into grapes and strawberries there. And they have a strawberry festival every February over these crops that they were able to take from Buffalo, New York, where the growing season was short, and make a big fuss of it in Florida. So they're in all the stores, apparently in the grocery stores there. I thought you might help me with that.
I'll look for that. You brought up an interesting topic that will warm Dominic's heart. The greatest Italian-American agriculturist was Gino Paolucci in Florida. Gino moved his Chungking empire to Florida to grow water chestnuts here and bamboo shoots and things like that.
Was he Gino's Pizza also?
Gino's Pizza. Only in America, with an Italian-American from Duluth, Minnesota, I think his mother was Jewish, make his first fortune in Chungking.
Was it Gino with a J?
Of the National Italian American Foundation.
Yes.
Founders.
Paolucci?
Paolucci. With a U. P-A-U? Is that right, or O?
Yeah.
I think it's with a U.
Yeah.
They the spelling.
But was his business not Geno, Geno?
Yes, which of course is not
okay.
Italian.
That makes sense to me. Yeah.
Americanized.
Ed, you want to make a general comment?
Sorry, are you talking to me, Dominic?
Yeah, Ed, make a comment on the goings on today.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by all this stuff about Florida. I sort of, I've been there a few times, but haven't stayed for a long period of time. So I want to know, Professor, why did the Italians in the chain migration story, what work did they come to do? The trains, the farming, or why were they attracted to Florida?
Good question, and it's complicated.
Yeah.
The first wave originally came to Louisiana to cut sugarcane also. One of the reasons it was cheaper to travel from Palermo to New Orleans. My grandparents came to New Orleans, for instance, but so did many of the Sicilians in Tampa. And after the lynching, many moved from Louisiana to Tampa. But one of the stories is that there was a huge sugar plantation in Florida, and the Sicilians worked there, but it was seasonal work, cutting, and they were looking for work off season, and they stumbled into Tampa, and Ybor City, they were speaking Spanish, which is akin to, and they were treated better than anywhere else. So that's how they connected to Ybor City, and they worked exclusively in the cigar industry, but they also had dairies there. Many of the Sicilians lived high up in the mountains in Sicily, and they were shepherds, and they made cheese. So Sicilians in Tampa were pioneers in the dairy industry.
Huh. Interesting. And the train, building train tracks and so forth.
They did. You're absolutely right. They were working on the railroads.
Oh, yes. Hello, Professor Candelaro. I hope you can hear me. And
indeed.
As you know, my field is education. I'm a principal and in a very multi-ethnic school. And our concern is more about bridging ethnic groups than bonding them, going towards inclusion. How far is Professor Mormino interested in the bridging phenomenon for Italian immigrants in Florida or elsewhere? And if he considers it basic to bridge other than bond?
That is interesting. I've never heard put that way. That is fascinating. I can speak to the Italian educational experience in Tampa, and it's very interesting. For the first generation, they were very poorly educated, but the parents soon figured out around World War I that these free schools are really something, and that there's no future in the cigar industry, and they tended to be rather well educated. If you look at the educational leadership in Tampa, there's many Italian American educators in prominent positions. At the University of South Florida as well. I'm going to have to mull on that. I just have never encountered that concept. I'd like that. That's a great verb, bridging. Tell me, what would be the difference between bridging and bonding? I understand bonding.
Oh, okay. In this case, Italians would bridge or mingle with other ethnic groups rather than an integrated one. Not giving up their own culture, but learning about other cultures, being with other ethnic groups. This for Italian American concern with this, and is it important for you to bridge rather than to bond within the Italian ethnic group?
Well, you know, in many ways, and I'm glad you clarified that. In many ways, that was what happened in Ybor City. With you had these four distinct groups: Black Cubans, White Cubans, Spaniards, Sicilians, and really among the Spaniards, the Gallegos, the Galicians, and the Asturianos were very different. And basically, the people bridged there. They realized, listen, the Anglos hate all of us. It's crazy if we're going to be rivals to one another. So you could go on Saturday night. When I would interview people, they would tell me on Saturday night, they would go to 4 or 5 of the mutual aid societies, the different ones, to listen to the bands, the different bands, and you could go in and fraternize there. So Tampa may have been a pioneering community in this case. If you get a chance to look at my book, there's a subchapter called Interethnic Relationships. Mm-hmm. And there's also a subchapter on education called Immigrant World of Ybor City.
Yeah. Barbara, comment, go around to sign off?
Here. Yeah, I enjoyed particularly hearing how the Italian and the Spanish language were connected in the vocabulary that developed. When I learned Italian in Chicago, 30 years ago, my teacher was from Cortona. And of course, a proud Tuscan from Dante's Italian area. She taught us that Spanish is a dialect of Italian. And I think it's a possibility.
You know, every Italian immigrant I interviewed in Tampa spoke fluent Spanish. Almost none of getting back to the bridging, almost none of the Spanish or Cubans spoke Italian. By the way, and they really were speaking Sicilian dialect there's a great story about this. During World War II, every Italian kid from Tampa promised their mother, if we're in Sicily, we'll visit the village of origin. Mm. Your aunt who's still alive, the sister who never came. And when they went there, everyone was laughing at them because they were speaking a dialect that was only the vecchi, the old folks were speaking. Whereas the Sicilians were now speaking.
Oh, yes, that's true. That's interesting.
That's true. Okay,
we have a restaurant in Chicago, Club Lago restaurant, where there's a lot of Mexicans who work there. So if you go there now, we all tend to speak a little bit of this. We speak Italian, we speak English, and we speak Spanish, and it all sort of works together, which is an interesting kind of thing.
Que bella.
Okay, Vita, comment from you.
Allora. Ciao Dominic, devo andare adesso. Ciao, ciao.
Vita. Okay, anybody else who didn't have a chance to say anything? Jeanette.
Well, I had a couple of comments. A lot of these things have come into play when we've had other discussions too, so it's really interesting. But I used to work for Social Security for 30 years, and
as did my wife.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
I worked at the Program Service Center in Chicago, and my husband was in the office. But anyway, I had to do a lot of things with the expediting staff and so forth, and we noticed there was a tremendous amount of correspondence that came in. And of course, when I saw an Italian name, do I know this person, whatever. And Social Security numbers were issued based on where you lived at the time you got your number. So of course, the Chicago people had certain numbers. So anyway, they would write for information about their retirement and whatever. But we noticed that there was a tremendous amount of Italians living in California and Florida at the end of the 1900s. They had been able to retire during immigration, and then they left for greener pastures and warmer weather. And they seemed to like cities that had Mesa in the name, like Costa Mesa, Arizona, and Mesa, California, whatever. I guess that sounded good. But California, Florida, and Arizona had a lot of Italians, and we just noticed that from the mail that came in. And back to Gary, what you said about family in Argentina, I know there's a lot of people from Casa Italia have relatives in Argentina, whether they know them or not. We know we have relatives. One branch of the family came here and one branch went to South America, and then also some went to Australia. But we have a Chicago Marathon every year, and I always check the names to see if there's anybody I know. And there's a few from Casa Italia who come from, who've been to our Casa Italia, I should say. And there was a lady who raced in the marathon, and she had the same last name as my family. And she came from Argentina to race in Chicago. And I looked up the last name another time and Googled it, and there's some race car driver in Argentina with our last name. So we're all over the place. You know, if you really do some kind of Google searches, you'll see Italians are everywhere. You might not know them as relatives. There's still many other places where they could be outside of Italy.
Okay, we're at the end of the, anybody have any emergency announcements?
No, è molto interessante, Dominic,
Okay.
grazie.
Sì,
Thank
sì,
you,
sì.
Gary.
Thank
all of
you. Ciao, Bella.
Keep on
Ciao.
coming.